Greetings, book fans, fans of literature, fans of reading. Welcome back to the Book Nook. Today I'm doing something a little different for this segment, doing a short story review. Not a review of an entire novel or anything, just of a little short science fiction story, because I recognize that novels take a long time, and while I'm at it, I can just review a little short entry from this sci-fi anthology here, Store of Infinity by Robert Sheckley. So this is a really interesting and fun anthology that covers 8 different stories, each one set in a hypothetical possible future. The one I'm going to be covering today, The Prize of Peril, is the first story in Store of Infinity, and I'm sure I'll be reviewing at least one more story from this fantastic little collection eventually, but for the time being, I'm just going to stick with the first one. The Prize of Peril is really good. I was amazed at how great this sci-fi anthology looks. The cover is still really glossy and sharp, even though it is from like 1960, so it's in fantastic condition. The font on the back here is really eye-catching. I could just tell the moment I saw this, oh my gosh, this is going to be a fantastic read. And I was correct. The Prize of Peril is a fantastic opening to this collection and a wonderful little entry. So I'm going to explain the general premise, but this is a spoiler-free review because holy shit, I recommend reading this front to back. It'll only take you about 30 minutes or so. If you have access to a copy of this somehow, I don't know how the heck people in the modern age can get their hands on science fiction this good. The only way might be to just go to your local bookstore and ask if they have a copy of Store of Infinity by Robert Sheckley. It might not be available on Audible or whatever, but heck, I don't know, maybe it is. If it is, give it a try. Anyway, like I said, this is a spoiler-free review, so I'm just going to be explaining the general premise and historical significance of The Prize of Peril. The Prize of Peril is a fun little short story that follows the adventures of Jim Rader, who's a contestant on this horrible game/reality show called The Prize of Peril, where he's effectively hunted down by hired killers. Now you might be saying to yourself, this sounds oddly familiar. This sounds like the Hunger Games. Damn straight. The Prize of Peril is part of the same sadistic game/reality show subgenre as the Hunger Games, Battle Royale, Rollerball, Death Race 2000, and a lot of other notable entries. Now, I've said in the past that I really prefer Rollerball and Death Race 2000 over Battle Royale or Hunger Games, both of which I think are kind of shit. However, after reading through The Prize of Peril, I have to admit that not only is this theoretically the first example of the premise in science fiction, but it's also probably my favorite just after reading it. I might give it a little time to sit with me and see how I feel about it in a couple months, but I'll probably still prefer this over Rollerball, Death Race 2000, Hunger Games, the whole ass 9 yards, because this story is so phenomenally well written. Robert Sheckley has such a phenomenal sense of pacing, timing, scene composition. Recently, Zane Whitener from In Praise of Shadows made a whole video about the premise of sadistic game shows and kind of tracked their history throughout cinema. But this short story was not mentioned in there at all, which I find wild because, again, this is from 1960, so a decade before Death Race 2000 ever hit the market. And it is, in every way, emblematic of this type of subgenre, and the best possible things about this subgenre, the best possible societal commentary that the subgenre could make. I admit, I really used to hate the Hunger Games type story. Then I saw Death Race 2000 and I was like, oh, it can be kind of cheesy and fun if it's handled well. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the funniest, most delightful thing I've read in a long time. This story brought me immense joy just because of how completely twisted and fucked up it is. It's amazing. There are a lot of media illiterate people who are like, oh, Hunger Games in the original Battle Royale did it first. Japan did it first. But if you actually bother to read American science fiction, you'll find that most often, most of the prominent ideas in modern science fiction originate with little soft cover pulp books like this one, and the minted, twisted reality game show type deal is no exception. Robert Sheckley, I'm pretty sure, invented it. Unless anyone can point to a short story earlier than this, in which case, I'll eat my hat. Nom nom. You might be asking, how does the Prize of Peril set itself apart from Hunger Games and even something like Death Race 2000 to become the most genius entry in the entire subgenre? Well, the answer is, it's fucking hilarious. This is an extremely funny story. This is one of the greatest pieces of satirical science fiction I've ever read. Robert Sheckley has an immense understanding of the human condition. He is very, very spot on with everything he says here. It is an extremely smart, funny, gut-busting story from beginning to end. Admittedly, I haven't always been on board with so-called satirical science fiction because it usually isn't as smart or as clever as it thinks it is. For instance, 1984 by George Orwell, which is an overrated piece of shit that's just poorly hidden anti-communist propaganda from some delusional British freak who eats dirt in his fucking cottage and can't stay married for like 5 years because he's a raving misogynist. That is often propped up as satire just because all the ideas in it are stupid. So people think, oh, if we say that George Orwell was a satirist, then people can just excuse his dumb shit and all the dumb crap he says. But that's not a good example of satirical science fiction. Admittedly, someone like Kurt Vonnegut is way better at combining elements of science fiction and humor and satire into a really potent cocktail. But I have to admit, Robert Sheckley does have Kurt Vonnegut beat. Maybe not in the premise department, maybe not in like the heady premise type category where you have all these weird things going on that are legitimately interesting and thought-provoking, but in the funny category, this is way funnier than Harrison Bergeron or any of the like satirical sci-fi stories that Kurt Vonnegut wrote. The Prize of Peril is fucking hilarious. I am telling you, it is one of the funniest things I have ever read. Tears were rolling down my fucking cheeks from how funny this story is. It is freaking amazing. It's basically just like Rollerball or Death Race 2000, and it even details a kind of precursor to Death Race 2000 called Spills, which is a kind of reality show that doesn't involve running people over. It just involves letting a bunch of amateurs drive cars dangerously. It's not as fleshed out as Death Race 2000, but it's interesting nonetheless that Robert Sheckley had the idea of a dangerous auto race, again, like a decade before Death Race 2000. The real genius of the Prize of Peril is that every other line is like a joke, because the premise is so fucked up and so sadistic. Keep in mind, this is 1960, and what this story is about is more twisted and insane than anything Twilight Zone or any contemporary science fiction show would have been able to cover in those days, because obviously a sci-fi paperback like this would have been less censored. Every other line is a payoff, and the preceding line is a setup, and you're just like, this is so funny. You don't want to laugh at the predicament that Jim Rader finds himself in, but at the same time, it's absolutely hilarious. The sheer absurdity of a game show where people just die and kill each other and ultimately win nothing of any real consequence except a cash prize. This is the kind of idea that the subgenre of the sadistic reality game show type thing that The Running Man and Death Race 2000, all these other examples, try to tackle. The Prize of Peril knocks it on the fucking head by adequately capturing what is so disturbing and twisted and messed up about this kind of premise, and I love it for that. It is absolutely spot on in every regard. It is a 10 out of 10 story. There are no flaws to it. It is that well written and paced. I will admit there's one problem I have with the story, which is that the one prominent female character in it is just kind of a generic love interest who just kisses the main guy, and then she's just like, oh, I'll be your girlfriend now. And admittedly, I'm asexual, so I view things like this in literature a bit different than anyone else might. And admittedly, this is a very short story, so there's not much time to introduce this girl, but she's not a very well-developed character, and it's just kind of emblematic of sci-fi of the time. I don't know. See if it bothers you. Your mileage may vary. I just found that kind of odd, and it kind of detracted from the main theme of the story, like the main focus. But other than that, this story is sharp as a knife and does not let up. It is suspenseful, it's gripping, and it's really, really hella funny. One thing which I think science fiction should always function as is effective social commentary. And the Prize of Peril is basically a statement on how the average person, it brings this up again and again, which isn't really touched on in Death Race 2000 or Rollerball, because those movies do follow professionally trained athletes, whereas the premise of the Prize of Peril is much more so that the contestant in this warped reality show is an average guy, and humanity wants to see themselves in this figure who's on the run for his life. There's also some commentary on like legalized euthanasia and stuff in here too. But ultimately, it's about who the public wants to see win. Do they want to see the good guy win, or do they want to see the bad guy win? So ultimately, it's a story about human nature and whether we intrinsically want to see good or evil be victorious in the struggle. It's very ideologically interesting like that in a way that's totally unique from Death Race 2000 or Rollerball. Neither of which I hate or anything, and I don't think either of them ripped this off or anything. I find that oftentimes really good imaginative sci-fi writers and directors and stuff have kind of parallel thinking, especially about something like reality TV, which obviously was in its infancy even when Death Race 2000 and Rollerball were being made. And this is from 1960s, so basically like when TV itself was in its infancy. My hat has to go off to Robert Sheckley as being insanely ahead of his time, and I wonder why it is that he's not seen in a contemporary light like Ray Bradbury or something, because he is a fucking phenomenal writer. This is extremely well-written stuff. Pure literary gold, and way better than anything the sci-fi genre has put out in the last decade. No contest. The Prize of Peril is also interesting in that it's about this goof-ass who just does all this dangerous shit because he wants money. And near the end, again, I'm trying to stay spoiler-free, but there's this really interesting commentary about how he basically doesn't have free will. He thinks he has free will, but he really just wants the money. And again, that's a very interesting statement on the nature of capitalism. Like, do you have free will under capitalism? Would you have free will potentially under socialism? That's not a question this book explores, but it is no wonder that so many great sci-fi authors in their time were labeled communists, because if you have an active imagination and you write sci-fi, you do tend to realize, hey, capitalism is kind of stupid. It's kind of a system that doesn't make any intrinsic sense. It's no wonder that sci-fi at this time was considered like very subversive and challenging, because to question these institutions, which the Prize of Peril absolutely does for 1960, I would consider it radical literature. To question these institutions is world-changing and can break some people's minds. And as the cover here advertises, these stories are guaranteed to strain, sprain, or maybe even snap the most agile imagination. And I have no doubts in 1960 this absolutely did. I would say if you consider yourself a socialist or you're anti-capitalist or something, you might get something out of this story. And even if you're not, you'll probably get something out of the story because it's fucking hilarious. And I just find it amazing that stories like this were being written in fucking 1960, and we're still making crap like The Hunger Games all this time later and still going, oh, isn't capitalism so bad? Oh, we're in late-stage capitalism. Which I don't even necessarily agree with that term, because I think it's kind of presumptive to assume that we're in the late stage of capitalism. It could go on for centuries and centuries more before a viable alternative is discovered and implemented. But nonetheless, it's just fascinating that ideas like this have been going around for as long as they have, and very few people take the time or effort to read great American sci-fi like this. Some classic shit. Robert Sheckley is on another fucking level, and the Prize of Peril is a thematically deep, wonderful story. This book makes for a wonderful addition to any sci-fi collection, and I hope to review some more of it soon. That's my review of The Prize of Peril from Store of Infinity by Robert Sheckley. If you happen to have this book, let me know what you think of it down in the comments below, and I look forward to reading some more of it. This is a real fun collection, and I hope you enjoyed the review. Subscribe for more killer, burning, hot sauce, mentally challenging content, yo!